oh, don't criticize selling out. It's actually good. Make it cool and like part of the culture with like, fuck you, pay me. Like, this is the most important part. And make it, me, which was also an argument I encountered. Me doing this mural in Twitter is reparations. No. Just no,
What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see. Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
One of my most brilliant friends, Jemma DeCristo, returns. On this episode, we were going to talk about Jemma's new book, The Aesthetic Character of Blackness, Sounds Like Us, which I got to read the draft of, and I'm excited that it's now ready for the world. The book opens in downtown Oakland in 2020 during the uprisings and describes how quickly Black revolutionary culture and art was co-opted in that moment, and how it's repackaged for consumption by people who are often not Black at events like Art Murmur, the night markets, open galleries that happen often in the first floor of new and otherwise empty condo buildings that are only affordable to people who aren't from Oakland. Jemma's going to delineate between the Black arts movement and art made by Black people, and how, as Theodore Adorno says, it's one of the quotes that Jemma uses in the book, the bourgeois want art voluptuous and life aesthetic. The reverse would be better. And then another big takeaway from the book that I am always thinking about as I am making media is how if you are getting rich off of the art you produce, it's probably because that art is good for capitalism. And if you would like to support a project that I hope is sort of toxic towards capitalism, one that I never expect to make me rich, please go to patreon.com/sadfrancisco. Thank you always to everybody who is donating there. So we have Jemma back in the pod where she belongs. The episod with Ralowe, I think, is one of the most popular of the year.
The Signal one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that one. That was fun.
Now we're going to be critiquing another
Go over here.
aspect of culture, which is music. And
art.
Yeah,
more
generally.
Yeah, if art is a general.
When did you start thinking about music in a critical way?
In a critical way? Well, that's a good question. I made music in some capacity, probably going back to childhood. I took the piano and the violin. Never really was good at traditional music education. And we moved a lot, so it was just hard to have continuity in that. I know this is extra information. You're not really getting quite this much biography in the book.
It's true.
And I got into like probably electronic music, I guess people would now call it. I didn't really call it that when I was... Actually, I should say I really was into hip-hop when I was a teenager, which you can't really super see in the book. Maybe the intro in a way and the attention to Black culture more broadly. And also, it would be unusual generationally for someone who's Black and grew up in the US, I think, to have no relationship to hip-hop. But I was very into hip-hop as a teenager. It was not just a music I loved and listened to obsessively, especially rap music, which I know you're going to ask a question about later. It was also a way to connect to my brother, because my brother was a rapper. He was never super successful. I don't think he'll watch. Maybe he'll watch this. He was very talented, but he did open for some somewhat known people. And I always wanted to make the beats for him. So this was and I got, it was very cute. It was like we're half siblings, so we kind of grew up far apart. So it was always a way to connect. So music was always a way to connect. I got really interested in the, maybe what people back then would have viewed more as the back end or back side of, or back of the house production. Of music production, which, arguably has become sort of the foreground of music now, especially with computers and since there's kind of an overlap. Especially with things like DJing. I DJ'd a little bit as a younger person in college, after college. Didn't like that. There's not necessarily I don't think there's any of that, and we don't have to go super into that part of it. But I got really into making electronic music, and around the time I went to grad school, which was very immediately after college, I was exposed a little more to things people would call experimental music. I think I had encountered some experimental music forms when I was younger, but never really knew anything as like a genre or a minia or an idiom. And yeah, by the time I went to grad school at UC Santa Cruz, there's not a lot of, at least not that I was interested in, and not a lot of black music in Santa Cruz, not a ton of black people. But then when I moved to San Francisco, there were big experimental music scenes, comparatively speaking. I mean, no, very few places could say how they have huge experimental music scenes, but there's a long experimental music history in the Bay Area. Places like Mills, which I think has been brought, I think maybe you've had people talk about on the podcast, and kind of the decline, or however you want to call it, receivership or whatever, of Mills College, but had a really, really famous, prestigious electronic and experimental music history, as does, now it's absorbed into Berkeley, but Cinemat and those things were really big, like computer music things. The same time I moved here, I'd studied art a little bit in Cairo in Egypt. And this is kind of maybe an unusual trajectory, because in the US growing up, I grew up very poor. I never was really that exposed to museums. I did go to school near New York, so I did see museums in New York, and there wasn't a lot of music, but there was a lot of painting and other stuff. We'll probably talk about paintings and murals and art in a broader sense. But Cairo was the first place where I lived where we were really exposed to contemporary artists, like, official fine artists, which other than students, I hadn't really met. And I had this amazing Egyptian art teacher who has a gallery now, Eleya Hamza, who I don't imagine she'll catch this, maybe. And she still has a gallery called Gypsium Gallery, I think it's called, in Cairo. So she would have artists come into the class, some of whom were experimental musicians in Cairo, and hearing artists talk about their work, which I think you get if you go to art school. I didn't go to art school. I just went to, regular college. And like I said, I didn't have a lot of, or really any formal art training, but hearing artists, some of whom had very, professional, streamlined training to make art, and some who hadn't, talk about their art and why they made it and how they made it, really made me go like, oh, this is possible to do more expansive things with music other than just play in a band, make beats for someone, which was something I did a little bit too, or be in some kind of DJ, which again, I wasn't super big fan of, but there was an interest in that. So at the same time that was happening, I think there were a lot of people that were taking kind of more experimental approaches to hip hop production and electronic music, and I sort of got pulled into various scenes. I don't even know if the Bay Area is very sceney, which is something maybe we'll kind of reference or talk about, but I kind of moved through those scenes. I don't feel like they were ever super established scenes. Some of them were, I wouldn't really call them black musical scenes per se, but there were black musically derived scenes. There were black people in them. Queer art scenes, queer music scenes, electronic music scenes. And that is kind of, and then there was a good period where I made and performed electronic music that was experimental. I performed with some local people. Someone who is no longer here, I think he lives in Europe, but was really great, was Marshall Trammell, who's really cool. If people don't know who Marshall is, very political, very community grounded, black experimental artist, incredible percussionist, studied with a lot of very influential black experimental improvisers, I would say specifically. And I also as I got more into music here, there's a very big improvisatory musical tradition. And that was very influential because it really fascinated me. And to kind of bring some of it also back to academia, if you will, or books, which the cover definitely looks like this book, which I think was intentional by Duke. I was very influenced by In the Break, the Fred Moten book, which he talked a lot about improvisation. This book had been out for a while at that point, but I think it made me very curious about improvisation as a broader orientation towards art and music and life. And I'm very interested in it now, and particularly with theater, which you experienced a little bit, and maybe we'll talk about later, theater and film.
My director. Yeah. Yeah, we are talking about Gemma's new book, which it's art criticism.
You could call it that. That's,
I think. Yeah. And when you say experimental, like,
yeah, sure.
For people who don't know, that this is a genre, experimental music.
I think people might push against it as a genre so much as a kind of relationship to practice or something like that, because there are genres within it. Like there's noise music,
right,
which, I think we're also at a point too where a lot of experimentation, and this also has a relationship to hip hop too, a lot of marginal or subcultural musics have been assimilated to dominant music sounds. I think you see that, and you're very into like dance music. You see that with like house and techno and all these things
like
too.
Recently, like Sophie, I think about like the hyperpop.
Yes, that's exactly the period for me.
It's just pop now.
Yeah, exactly. And that was, I remember, I don't think I ever met Sophie, but I maybe would have performed in places that she did when she came here a long time ago. She was much younger, and like Arca and those kind of people. Yeah, so especially for other trans women, trans feminine people, I definitely do remember that kind of sound being around. And absolutely, it was much more tied to these small venues, weird crowds of people nodding their head, or just kind of weird, tinkering, lots of tinkering kind of spaces going on. So and then a few years later, seeing it in, big music production with major stars.
Right. Yeah. And so noise music specifically, we do have a festival every year here.
Yeah.
So that's another local tradition. Yeah. So obviously a lot to draw from when you started writing about music and art. It starts out, the book, The Aesthetic Character of Blackness, by the way, is we start in Oakland. We start in 2020.
Yeah.
And my first question is, what do you have against murals?
So the book starts talking about the role of murals. And like I said, it's a broad, I'm not just say broad, it's kind of a, I guess we could say sort of broader, multidisciplinary approach to something called art or the aesthetic. And murals, I think this is a little less of an unusual critique now, but one thing I noticed was this kind of memorializing function that murals had in the Bay Area. And I think you've had people talk about this in a different way on the podcast before. I think of, for example, in Oakland, in the context of Oakland, right, in some ways how murals, how there's this kind of memorialization in the Bay Area in general. I think there's this kind of memorialization of the past as a way to say, well, we really appreciate what people were then, but we're not necessarily advocating for the things they were advocating for now.
Same with, we've talked about cultural districts before, and same kind of idea is memorializing.
Right, and that's actually a great example, is that the cultural districts, which you can tune into that podcast, which I think is one of your most viewed.
Yep.
And that was a moment a little around when I was writing this book where I started to notice, right, that there's this way in which representations of us, and you have the sounds like us, the us in the title of the book comes from this, we're being used to push the actual us out of these neighborhoods. And it was happening at the same time that the more invisibilized force, aesthetically, more neutral appearing, of like luxury condos, of cafes, of small, boutique businesses, as these were kind of appearing in the background. Or really, I think kind of these are the if I were to talk about it in terms of aesthetic, part of the book is trying to say, like, these are really the frame for the mural, right? These are the things which bring the mural to you as a piece of art. A lot of these public murals, right? And even we could say the notion of public art, which the book does talk a little bit about the history of in the 60s, though it's an older tradition. I mean, murals go back to maybe as we think of them, the 1930s. You think of people like Diego Rivera, I think there's still the SFAI has a Diego Rivera mural that maybe goes back that far, which is kind of arguably the beginning of like the mural movement of, which I reference a little bit in the book, the kind of socialist, social realist approach to murals. I think most people know who Diego Rivera or Frida Kahlo, less associated with murals than paintings. But yeah, and I talk about in the 60s how the mural culture, more so outside the Bay Area, I look at places like Chicago, but this is also true of the Bay Area, became these sites for, murals became a form for a lot of Black and especially oppressed people, right? I think you can also, there's a way to relate this to other sort of oppressed folks, became a kind of way to claim ownership of their neighborhoods, ostensibly. Or is really interesting, at least for me, in the book, it was specifically in the context of Chicago. I talk about groups like, if people are familiar with them, Afro-Cobra, or what they were called earlier. Before that, Obasha, which was this Black artistic collective of some fairly well-known Black artists at the time and beyond. And they used murals to fight sort of what we would call urban redevelopment or urban renewal, like something, again, you've talked about on the
marking
podcast.
Territory.
Yeah.
And in a way, warning people who maybe aren't of the culture to...
This is a Black neighborhood, don't come in. In a way, I would actually argue, and I don't think those artists would agree with me about this, but I think in a certain kind of way, it functioned almost as a way to blight the neighborhoods against the narratives of blight, right? Because you have to look at in let's say the 60s, right? Blight, to use that word, right, was commonly used to argue for the redevelopment of neighborhoods, as it is now, with YIMBYs, who have been talked about frequently on the podcast. And I think in a weird way, and they frame it a little bit differently when you read interviews with them, but I think it was a way to remove, whether they knew it or not, the value, the state as a development force, which is also to say emerging private markets, because, right, development was much more framed in terms of the city than it was through private development in the 60s, to a degree. I mean, to the extent that we want to say those are even different things, I would argue they're not necessarily, they do the same things to Black people, right? They both exploit Black people, the market and the state. There's a way in which murals in, say, like the 60s were much more about pushing against the value that the state was trying to impose on poor Black neighborhoods, right? As like blighted. And it was like a way to say like, no, there is life here. There is Black life here. There's Black history. Things that to a greater degree, Black people were viewed not to have, right? And we can go back to, if people have ever, I feel like this is a pretty popular book, but if people have ever read Herskovits, who was, this kind of cultural anthropologist who pushed against this idea that Black people had no history or past, right? Which was a myth reproduced through the slave trade. Now I think it's a case where quite deceptively or quite sinisterly, murals have been grafted to the structures of valuation and aesthetic production that can push Black people out of a neighborhood, right? Like, and you can think of a term that I think we've talked about on the podcast too, kind of artification, right? And that Black art through decades, and hip hop is a great example, is no longer threatening to people the way it would have been in the 60s, or you could certainly go back to the blues the book talks about, or jazz, right? I mean, and you can look at the way white people wrote about jazz in the 20s is very hysterical. Like they're like, oh my God, something is literally infecting our white children. It's very similar to the way people would talk about other things. I won't go too off on that, but that is not the case because of decades of assimilation and integration and inclusion, right? So I think this goes, we both grew up enough in the 90s. I think that's a really interesting watershed moment where hip hop is being kind of assimilated to the mainstream.
Right.
And you could grow up in Orange County. I don't know if I'm outing you. And, people were listening to hip hop and it was like, oh, this is cool. And maybe it makes me slightly edgy. And then it goes to being really mainstream. And
right. Now you might have, like white dad in Orange County.
Oh, yeah.
Giving not a physical CD, but perhaps, pointing
Playlists.
their kid
Yeah.
towards playlist that has like
Definitely.
Eminem on it or something.
Yeah, or even, more obscure hip. I mean, that's so. I think because that is the book kind of ends in the 60s, but it sort of it sets up. I mean, it does talk about it talks about a lot of contemporary stuff too. It does set up how something like that could happen. And when we have a period where Black art is not only no longer threatening, but has historically, and I actually argue this has happened for almost, for decades, if not more than a century, has been an agent of real estate, of the market. We could say the market. And I think in the case of the murals, it's much more rooted in real estate, where we're talking about space and place of Black neighborhoods, of poor neighborhoods. When we get to that point, Black art is less a threat or a warning and more an invitation. Hey, these neighborhoods have been, it's okay to come in and walk by and enjoy the murals. And in a way, the paradox the book talks a lot about, but again, I think it goes longer than this, is that what Black murals have are murals of Black people. I mean, often these are done by Black artists, but not always. What Black murals have done is they've kind of said, don't worry, this is the most distinct example. This is the only kind of Black people you'll see in this neighborhood. And I don't mean the murals depict good Black people. I mean that you only see this sort of simulacrum or synthetic representation, or representation really, of Black people. You won't see Black people themselves, or if you do, you'll see Black artists who, again, I think I would put as agents of real estate expansion, which was also something
in some cases. Yeah. So the book opens, including some pictures of 2020 downtown Oakland, and lots of, so not just murals, but photos, stock photos of Black people sort of looking like they're experiencing extreme joy. Meanwhile, you have these condo buildings that are completely empty, that are unaffordable to most of the people that, ostensibly they're depicting in these photos. And kind of on that same topic, so if murals are weapons against Black people, would tagging be a more libertarian version of Black art?
I think that's a good question. I mean, graffiti or tagging are interesting because it is one of those. It has a very. I mean, we could do a whole. That actually would be a great episode to do a podcast about. I wouldn't be the most qualified, but because the Bay Area had such a specific tagging style, I do know that, and there's some.
Yeah. To the point, where, I mean,
Contra New York, for example. Yeah.
People were getting like grand juried because their specific style was so known. They're being hunted down, basically.
And I think that goes both ways, where you do have a very, I don't know if it's a radical, but kind of threatening effect or capacity for graffiti. When you asked earlier about music, I got very into the kind of academic, what was in books. I mean, it's not just academic, but like available to me through books, history of hip hop music. And of course, that starts with graffiti. A lot of people would argue, or did argue in the early days, depending on what you consider hip hop, but tagging trains and, people have made the connection between, in New York, pardon the New York detour, have made the connection between how graffiti was erased from trains with Agent Orange, which they were using in Vietnam at the same time, the chemical, the deforestant that, killed countless people, and how there was this kind of coming home of U.S. empire that was targeting graffiti artists who also still do, I think, lead some kind of, very fugitive life, to use that term, or can, and I think probably did for a while. On the other hand, and I don't recall if this is in the book, but it is a photo I offered to them, and it may be in another article that I wrote that is, I think, only available. I wrote it for a friend who's also an Egyptian artist. I never completely went into that story, for the Centre Pompidou, so it might be in some, I think I have the book. And around the time I was taking these photos, there was this condo downtown Oakland on the corner of, I want to say it was I think it was 17th, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, set the scene.
Yeah, so
the book opens with.
Yeah, so this mural, which I don't think made it into the book, was a luxury condo, and on the side of it, it had what looked like, to the average eye walking by, graffiti as style, right? Which I think is also something to distinguish graffiti as style versus what
Communication.
communication, or even kind of that word I was using earlier, blighting, right?
Yeah.
Like blighting the blight.
Purposeful.
Like,
yeah.
As a way to be like, fuck this corporate flat aesthetic that is sort of subsuming us.
All you
whether
developers don't even think about
coming to this neighborhood because we will destroy the value that you're trying to create here.
These condos, yeah.
But on the corner, and so I think that's kind of something like some definition of maybe graffiti, as we'd want to think of it, as a more radical act. But there, on the corner of, I want to say it was either 17th, 18th, or 19th in Oakland, and I want to say like around Webster, I'm trying to think of the exact cross street, somewhere around there, Webster or Franklin, there was this mural that was, I would call it a mural, on the side of this luxury condo that was not yet open for lease or whatever yet. And it had this graffiti on the side. And if you glanced quickly, you could think it was like taggers seeing the luxury condo and being like, nah, fuck that, I'm going to tag this. But then if you looked a little closer, and especially if you were there at night, it had these almost gallery lights over it. Like, higher, we have a lot of lights, like these kind of LEDs aimed at it, that if you paused for more than a second, you were like, oh, they're featuring this graffiti.
Yeah.
So this is their way of kind of saying like, oh yeah, we're down. We're down, like Oakland, we're down, like, we support, I think is unquestionably a Black art form. And, we support this Bay Area Black style, like, look at us, But it was a very deceptive or sinister kind of approach, right? Because or pernicious, we could use this word, because it was about adopting or referencing the threat while showing that we have assimilated it, right? And we can manage it. And in a way, it's almost meant to totally defeat whatever capacity comes from the graffiti artist, or the graffiti, let's call it tagger. That's a better word. We don't use the word graffiti artist because we could get into like the Shepherd Fairies, which is also, again, there's these whole.
Sure.
And this goes back to graffiti. I mean, you can look at the movie Wild Style, right? It has that moment where he goes into the art gallery in this, I think it's in the 70s. But they want, in a way, that mural said to, as much as so that mural spoke at least two things to me. One, it's on a luxury condo. So it's obviously saying to anyone who could afford to live in a luxury condo, hey, come look at us. We're edgy. We're part of the neighbor. We're not gonna. We're a luxury condo. I mean, this is the obvious parts of a luxury condo. We're in a luxury condo, but kind of also we're safe.
Right.
Like we have a what looks like a gallery aesthetic, right? Because it had this kind of gallery lighting above it. We have that kind of, we have graffiti, but don't worry, it's not like actually gonna mess up your car or no one's gonna throw stuff at you when you come out. You're not gonna get robbed.
We're giving you that Oakland grit.
Yeah, exactly. We're giving you we're giving you a little bit of that grit, and you're gonna get. It's also a way, kind of, right, like to differentiate that luxury condo from the other 20 or whatever that were built around. I mean, downtown Oakland is a fascinating place for this reason. That has a history that goes back, probably most interestingly, to the first Black mayor of Oakland, too, which people can look into. And so it says that to the kind of luxury condo buyer, if you will. The other thing it says, I think, maybe most dangerously, because there have always been luxury things advertised to rich people. That's not, in and of itself, new, I guess, or novel, or menacing as the book is. What it kind of also says to the tagger is like, this is good. You can't pursue us. You can't do anything to us. You can't blight us. You can't blight the luxury condos. It would be like punching quicksand for you, right? Or punching sand. Like, we will absorb anything you can do. Any creativity you have, we will absorb it,
Yeah.
and we will sell it back to you. Is not quite, I mean, there's some of that. I don't know that it's directed at the same people, but we will marketize it, and we will neutralize it, and we will sell it to the kinds of people that we will insert it in the kinds of projects that will make sure you can no longer live here.
Right.
You know, and you won't be here to tag a building anyway, which I think that's the more, and to whatever artist did that graffiti stuff, which, you know, I don't know that specific mural. The other ones, some of the other ones are talked about in the book in a more delicate way, so as not to be like, this one person's bad, this one person's bad. But it does talk about how there's that agent of the Black artist that does these, that facilitates those kinds of messages, right? That's what the Black artist does in making that mural.
Yeah.
It facilitates those kinds of messages. So
yeah, you have a really good line in the intro. We're not just memorializing our fallen kin as cultural totems on commemorative murals. We are arming and aiding the institutions that are killing us. And you go on to say we need to steal back our lives. Also that Black life and its defense will always be a crime, and that the revolutionary, violent, the criminal, the deviant, and the queer will become increasingly threatening to the society that Black art aims to be made more sociable to. So you're kind of posing this. You're stating that because of the co-optation of Black art, we may need to look elsewhere for ways forward if we're interested in art that challenges the status quo.
Yeah, I think this is a great point to pick out in the book. I think the post-60s notion of art, maybe some people would say modernist, but I think for our context, I think in the Bay Area, and this goes back to that memorialization, the 1960s is such a watershed moment because there's so much upheaval that the state, the market, all these other forms of power and hegemony realize they can't stop through naked force, right? Like you think of all the rioting across all the, you know, so-called race riots or revolutions, whatever we want to call them, and many of which are, you know, there's artists in those. There is this response in the 60s to say, well, we can't fight them head on. The better way to fight them is inclusion, right? And that happens the same time as there are kinds of aesthetic parallels to that, right? There's a lot of art, and there are people that write about this. I have a colleague, Erin Gray, who does some really interesting work about Black art as well, and talks about Black art exhibits in particularly around lynching, but in the 40s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And if you read about Black art in museums in the 30s, 40s, 50s, there's not that much of it. There's not many Black artists. And there are a lot of Black artists in the, let's say, 60s in particular, who start to make these arguments that, well, fuck these places. They're racist. They, you know, the only time they might have images of Black people or things that look like Black art are usually done by a white artist. Like, we should build our own forms of institution, and we should build forms of art that are outside these institutions. So not just painting, not just, you know, and you see this with all the kinds of like performance. I mean, performance art has a really interesting history with this. That was something that, you know, whether we look at kind of a Black performance art tradition or a 70s feminist kind of performance art tradition, these were things that initially, at least on the surface, and, you know, people can contest this to some degree, sought to develop worlds outside of art institutions, right? So there is this, to be kind of succinct, there is this counter or contesting of art in a way that is very radical. And people are asking a lot of questions, like in the 60s, like, what really is art? You know, you see this like Schechner, Andy Warhol, to pick a very famous example.
Is this what we're talking about when, you know, you talk about the Black arts movement.
Yeah, a lot. So similar kinds of conversations are going on in the Black arts movement, exactly. And there's a very explicit attempt by Black artists, and if people have ever read the piece "The Black Aesthetic" by Larry Neal, to say we need to invent a whole new art, because what white Western art calls art is not for us, and it has never been for us, and it has never served us. So I think if you look at the 60s, it's fair to say, more so or actually if you look after the 60s, it's fair to say in a certain way that this was a threatening stance by black artists to a degree. I mean, I talk a little bit about it in a little more complexity, but what the response to that threat was, you can see this with any form of, I mean, this is why to some degree boycotts are effective, right? Is that you can see this with any sort of corporate institution. One of its biggest threats is people saying, we can live without you, right? Like, and we can, and I would emphasize live. We can live without you, and we can marginalize you. We can marginalize art to the point to where these institutions no longer have the kind of power to control who lives or dies, so to speak. Although I think that is also a real power they have. What the response to that was to include forms of Black art, and in ways that we just talked about in terms of appropriation. I mean, you could look at graffiti as a great example, and that became, graffiti starts to be represented in art galleries in the 1970s in New York as like an art form, right? And you see this with in a weird way, the history of photography has this too, which was also something that wasn't really considered an art until the 70s. So that you have these two seemingly warring things going on. One is this thing saying art can be anything. And art can be this thing that escapes the bourgeois conception of art, which is, maybe people would think of the idea of like high culture or 19th century conceptions of art. If you think of music, like common practice music, like Beethoven or whatever, things that people associate with the opera, high cultural things. And art can be this other thing. And then on the other hand, almost simultaneous with that, you have this response, particularly towards Black artists and Black art, to be like, anything you make, we will make into art. And I think there is a strand within Black art that says, that is for that capacity. And the quote you read, this is also something where I go back a long time for people that are interested in a longer history, that I really emphasize that term sociable a lot in the book, because if you go back to 18th century conceptions of the aesthetic, that's what aesthetics is rooted in. It's always rooted in making more threatening things sociable or agreeable to domination. That's the history of art in the West. I wouldn't say there's no other history, but I think that's a pretty core essential history to it, or genealogy. And there is why I think it's really important in the Bay, right, specific to think of the context, is that there has always been this, I think for our generation, notion that art can threaten the sociable thing, right? That it can always, it's, queer, Black, these things will disrupt. And the book is much more skeptical of that. It's actually saying, once you call something art, once you make something art, you've entered this centuries-long history of of neutralizing its most threatening contents or forms to these systems of domination, which don't end at art galleries, but end at, real estate, which is the biggest lobby in the United States. If we were to make it very contemporary, right?
I appreciate that.
It's not a small thing.
You bring it back to the number one cost in most of our lives, which is shelter. I think about it like I have gotten arts grants. And so, anytime that you're able to finagle some cash from the state, which funds the police that keep interrupting us, I am well aware that can infect whatever comes out of the grant that you happen to get from people who aren't necessarily don't always have a radical politic, and are trying to serve things like real estate, like politicians that are local politicians are, the number one funder of most campaigns is the real estate industry. Another thing, you bring in Henry Louis Gates Jr., and he, another art critic in our midst, and you take issue with his kind of declaration that we can have, mainstream art worlds that contain Black art where good representations of Black art can drown out the bad representations of Black art. What do you have against Henry Louis Gates Jr.?
I think well, he's kind of low-hanging fruit, right? Because I mean, but I liked that he said something this way. I think we paraphrased it. We could look up the exact quote. But yeah, he basically was like, he says something to the effect of, you fight a bad representation with a good one, he says. It's almost a verbatim quote.
Right.
And he's talking about Black art. It's actually quoted from this really amazing Charles Burnett experimental documentary called Nat Turner, A Troublesome Property, which I highly recommend. I love Charles Burnett, favorite filmmaker. Very fascinating. So that, I also want to talk about something else you kind of brought up, because we could also talk about the hustle. I think that so I'll bracket that, and maybe we can come back to that, but I'll answer your question directly, because I think it's more related to what I just said, which is that I think because art is about making more sociable, because Black art is about making more sociable Black people to a society that kills us, I think there is I wouldn't even call it parallel, but I would say simultaneous legal function of Black art. And that quote by Henry Louis Gates, that's something to the effect of, you fight a bad representation with a good one, is very similar to the argument, and this very much will appeal to viewers when we talked about like queer rights versus queer liberation type of thing, is very much the idea that you fight a bad law with a good law, right? So it is, or you fight bad police with good police, right? I think they're identical arguments. I don't think there's any difference. And that's something the book aims to connect, is to say, well, those are the same arguments. And that quite literally, we live in an era, and this goes back farther, I say maybe as far back as the Harlem Renaissance, but it arguably goes back to, and the book starts with Frederick Douglass when it gets into the history. I think it arguably goes back to the emancipation or manumission, the so-called abolition of slavery, is that's the way things like Black art were looked at, or Black music, which I talk more about, which was more the du jour kind of art, if you will, was about replacing the bad law of slavery with the good law of Black art. In another way, like, if we're going to free these Black people, these very, threatening, who are justifiably angry at white people, because, and many other who, because we've enslaved them for centuries, destroyed their families, raped, pillaged, every horrible thing you can imagine, right? And I think this is a very important function of art, right? Like, if we're gonna unleash, in their own minds, I'm speaking as if I was a white person who's even for or against slavery, because to the extent that they had different actual stances towards Black people is debatable. If we're going to unleash these people, who's to say they won't kill us, rob us, or again, this is projection, right? This is the projection of the colonizer society. It's the same thing when white people talk about land back. They're like, well, then I don't, what if indigenous people started murdering me and my family? Well, that's what you did, sweetie. Like, it's not. But that was again, of course, because we live in a very proprietary society, this is the paranoid defense that constitutes property, right? In the US. Oh, what if these Black people rise up and attack us? One thing Black music did in the 19th century, to kind of get back to your Henry Louis Gates question, right? Because he's a historian of slavery and all these other things too. One thing Black music did, and that was a lot of what he wrote about early on in the 70s and 80s, is that it, to use the quote earlier, made more sociable, made less threatening, made more amenable, made more valuable Black people to the society who had just, I mean, obviously it was still doing this, but had just enslaved them, had just brutalized them, had just done all these awful things and was continuing to do them. I mean, right, none of this stuff really ends after slavery. But that was the pitch of Black music, very much, if one was to draw a parallel to what Manning Marable would call the second Reconstruction, so the 1960s. Very much the way Black art, among, and Black music would be included in this, but maybe more so things like we think of Black fine art, murals, public art, is used in the 1960s, which is to say, boy, you've seen all these images of Black people rioting in the 60s through Black neighborhoods, whatever we mean by rioting, whatever, whether that means lunch counter sit-in stuff or just protesting, whether that means looting back what has been looted from them, right? You've seen all these images, white people, and maybe even to some degree ruling class, Black people, the ruling class, we could say, right? But don't worry, we will show you not only that we can undermine them in ways that we've talked about, this kind of way of undermining the threat of them by including them in the system, but we can show you there is money to be made, or capital in the traditional sense, but also a kind of imaginative capital, which the book talks a lot about, an even more speculative capital, or the origins of capital, which are speculation, in their culture, right? Like they're not just the argument, which is in there too, that there's Black artists are the good ones amongst these people, right? These are the ones who can kind of function as cultural diplomats. Mm-hmm. They're not going to stab you. They're not going to call you racist. They're not going to which is kind of true, right? Because, all Black artists love to complain about how racist art is, but never leave it, right? It's a very fascinating abusive relationship. There's that, but there's also this idea that don't worry, all this Black anger, you can still extract value from it. And I think, again, hip hop's a great example of that, because we grew up during when hip hop became kind of mainstream in the 90s. And that was a lot of the threat, right? You had the state being like, we need to put parental advisory labels, all this kind of, of course, which I'm sure a lot of it was just generated by record companies and things, right? But this idea that there is this threatening Black artistic form that is rap music, and corporate and other sorts of institutions, arguably academia was, even if it saw itself as on the side of rap music, showed the world like, oh, this thing you think is bad, we can actually extract value from it. We can bring it into the market. We can make it sellable. We can make racist people very rich off of art that ostensibly is critical of anti-Black racism, on some level.
At least, in the 80s.
So, in the 80s and 90s. Yeah. So I think that is the argument by Gates, that you can fight a bad representation with a good one, I think is very naive. I think it overlooks this idea that all we're doing with that kind of stance is making more law, or making more value, if you want to use the market example. And it's kind of the same way, I think, for viewers, again, people who would say you can fight a bad law with a good law. Like, no, that's just more law, right? And anyone who studied law, right, like things like legal realism and stuff, make this argument, as do critical race theory, critical race studies, right, is that all you're doing is expanding the law. If you're going to fight a bad police with a good police, you're adding more police, right? They're like, and art is an interesting forum or site of attack for this, because we don't often look at it like that. I don't think we often look at it, particularly Black art. And the last thing I'll say, and maybe we can get into the hustle question too, because I think that was kind of something you sort of bringing up in a way, whether you meant to or not, is I think people my age, especially Black people, Black artists, it's much further than this, grew up with this spirit of like, we need more representations of us, right? And this, again, like I said a moment ago, arguably goes back to the 19th century. It certainly is more explicitly talked about in the Harlem Renaissance. As technologies like film and sound recording become more dominant, there is a sense by which people can see more images or representations of people without ever having met the people, which was a little less common in the 19th century. unless you could read or, you know, a few other things. Yeah, it was much more exclusive.
The phonograph.
Yeah,
The camera.
The film camera, right?
Perhaps
These
you've
things.
heard of them, yeah.
These things are being invented 100 years ago, right? So, or expanded 100 years ago, mass marketed. So there starts to be this crisis in black art, or amongst the black bourgeoisie. I would actually distinguish it, and I think that's a really big distinction the book makes over and over again too. Which, again, when we get into the hustle, we can actually maybe talk about that a little. Is that it's really ruling class black people that become most anxious about this. Oh my God, they could see bad representations of us and think we're bad. And they could see, we need to make sure there's good representations of us so they think we're good. And right, it says a lot about it says about the very limited way the black bourgeoisie, or anyone who believes that way, thinks or understands their oppression, right? Is that, oh, if there were just good versions of us, which we can go into what that means to make versions that morally align with the people who are killing you.
Right.
But
yeah.
if there's just good versions, they'll let us be free. Which there is no example in history that points to that being
ahistorical.
That points to that being true. But it is a very, you know, and I think that also gets into, maybe we can talk about the hustle thing too. Like I keep bringing up, like it gets into the idea of what someone actually wants when they say that.
Yeah.
When they say you need to fight the bad representations with the good, like what world do they actually want? Do they want black liberation, or do they want something else?
Yeah, I mean, this is so esoteric, and I should never start a sentence while we're recording with this line, but we may want to cut this. On TikTok, there is a conversation happening about H Mart and Asians shopping at H Mart and helping white people that they notice in the aisles, kind of like unsure of where they should be. So there are some older generation Asians who are like, oh, you need to help those white people.
Sure.
And like you need to, like, in some cases people were arguing for kind of lingering in aisles where there are white people just to see if they might need some help. And encouraging white people to come to these Asian grocery stores, to come, you know, taste the culture. Taste the culture of H Mart. Support your Asian-owned mega corporations. And, you know, versus like there's younger, more radical content creators who are, well, that's pathetic. Why are you stopping to sort of, you know, like just you know, being so submissive to white people who are ostensibly like in one of the few spaces that is, you know, it's a capitalist space, but like where you know, 10 years ago there wouldn't have been white people who were interested in whatever Korean novelties you could get at H Mart. Sorry, so that is an aside, but let's talk about hustle culture. I was talking about like grants.
I guess
you know,
where you were going with that.
I'm out there. You know, we're in a place where
austerity.
It is hard to. It has always been.
It has always been us. I mean, we have always been austere.
We're losing the National Endowment for the Arts. We have AI competing with people who would have been able to maybe make a living off of their artistic skills. And so increasingly, I mean, this hustle culture is getting, I mean, it's a race to the bottom.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I like that.
You're trying to appeal to foundations that might give you grants. You're trying to appeal to museums that might give you exposure, since you're not making a lot of money from museums typically. And you actually bring that point up in particular, like the idea that in many cases, people who are, you know, not already really established artists, they're doing this just because of the promise of like getting seen by a few more people. It's not even like material material, like there's no wealth transfer there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great thing to bring up, because then I can also go back into some Bay Area history too. And I think a lot of what you brought up is really important. So when I started to make art here, I moved to the Bay around the time of Obama's election, right? So you kind of had this, which his rise itself was this kind of, as I think people are now understanding it as this kind of moment of multicultural fascism where there's a representational politic that can sanitize as violence, right? Yeah. And so you have this very big project of kind of Black representation that, it works in several ways. I mean, one of the things we see is there becomes, as of course that was very predictable for many of us, that there is on the individual level, I think this kind of, to pick apart what you're talking about the hustle, there is this individual demand put on artists or subjects who are, ostensibly, we'll just say artists, Black artists, that you can make it, right? Because you have this very high, not to even talk about him as a person, but representation, right? Because to talk about Obama as a representation, you have this very wide-reaching representation. This is also the time of Beyonce. I think this is the really big rise of Beyonce in the 2010s, basically, and early 2010, and beyond. And so there becomes this idea that there's what, among other things, Obama, Beyonce, this kind of moment that I think a lot of people have a good sense of now, because we're out of that era, I think, to a great degree, or potentially, is that it got a lot of Black people to reinvest in capitalism. And when we use the word invest, to your point about not getting real money, and this is what the book is very interested in with art, because art often doesn't really involve money, which I think is an interesting part about it. It doesn't involve, in terms of our, maybe you or I's creative faculties, which the book talks a lot about too, it doesn't necessarily directly involve material capital, right? It doesn't, I'm not being paid. I've rarely been paid to make art. I can't say for you, you're talented, you're so talented. But often is the case. But often is the case for a lot of Black artists that they're not paid to make art.
Right.
And you could go back to the history of Black art. Anyway, what the kind of Obama moment, Beyonce moment did was it had the disciplining effect. It had the double effect, the stick and the carrot, of saying, that the carrot of hey, Black people, look, you could become Beyonce, or Solange was the more edgy one, or whatever. Mm-hmm. You can become one of those. And Solange is interesting because she was always kind of weirder, her aesthetic. But, I think it had this kind of moment, and you could pick a million examples. Get Out comes out a little later. There's all these kinds of Black artistic examples. And, and interestingly, a lot of the art design for those people comes from Black artists who were a little more obscure. You think of Beyonce always would do this thing where she had a more a Black poet, or a Black painter, or a Black video artist who was a little more obscure. Sometimes there were people I kind of knew or knew of at the time who, I would have never thought, oh, they're going to do a major music video for art, one of the more famous musicians in the US. So you had this moment where you saw the carrot of capitalism got bigger or closer to Black people, at least symbolically. Oh, you could be Beyonce, or again, I'm speaking about Obama. And then the other way is the stick actually got bigger, but the stick, if you will, the stick to, drive, but, the historically you could say the whip, became more internalized, right? So for Black people, it was because you can get that carrot of the big arts grant, or you can get that carrot of a gallery show or whatever, you need to self-discipline or self-regulate or regulate. I mean, this, to pick another word the book uses a lot, which again goes back to the 18th century. You need to regulate yourself, which another word we could use to point out the window is police, right? You need to police yourself the way you police yourself in all forms of labor, right? Marketized labor, in order to make value. You can hustle your way out of poverty or whatever, right? And I think there are broad ways in which this was true. And, you can think of how hustle culture became part of tech and all these other, we could have a whole podcast on the hustle. But one way, it really instilled in a lot of Black artists, and I'll go back to my experience because I still didn't bring that in, this idea that they can really make it, particularly on their own. I think what was shocking for me was coming here and making art, meeting other Black artists, especially Black queer artists, and kind of wanting to do things collectively. I really wanted to my dream at the time, it's no longer is the case, my dream was to form a Black artistic collective where we would, make our art collectively, share resources, maybe, even share grants if other, some people are good at doing or some people, maybe someone will be the grant writer, we'd share materials, share publicizing our own work, collaborate, especially things like, I was very into video art and film, and music. Most of those are art forms you tend to do more with people as opposed to maybe say painting or sculpture. You might do that alone. I did do sculpture too and installation stuff. So I found that very few Black artists wanted to do something like that with not just me, which is fine if people don't do that with me, but with anybody. And it was a much more individualized landscape. And it was a landscape of a lot of Black artists who were, I would say it's two things. They wanted to make it alone, and the only value other Black artists had to them was as networking opportunities. And in a lot of ways, this is a very intense kind of possessive individual endeavor, right? Which was that Black art was a hustle. It was a way to advance yourself in society, sure, but also in the art, whether in the art world or music, and that the ends of it were self-possession, self-realization, individual financial success. I think career and professionalization is a big part of this. There was absolutely no desire to construct collectivity, accountability, alternatives to these models, sustainability collectively achieved through each other. There was much more an idea that I want to be in the market. I want to be Beyonce, Obama, whatever, pick the person, right? And that was very tied to the hustle because it was very much tied to this, I think, delusion now that you could, again, this is very American, of course, right? That you could work your way out of your own oppression, as a poor Black person. Although I will say a lot of Black artists were not poor that I met. They were rich too, which I think is just like a lot of queer artists here. You might be like, oh my God,
Totally.
You must have had it so hard. And then you see them at Thanksgiving, posting Thanksgiving pictures, and you're like, oh, that's the house your parents live in?
Same with media. Yeah, there are certain if you can afford to call yourself an artist, throughout history, it's tended to be people who came from money or have
some magical, amazing rich, security. That's a big one.
Same with journalism.
Yeah. That's so there was a lot of class. I mean, really, what we're talking about is a lot of class politics to it. So there was, which I think is also interesting because I think it's also the way back to the Obama Beyonce example that moment when it got Black people to reinvest in capitalism. Again, I don't think Black people had that much money. That there's a collective, we don't, right? But it got Black people to invest energy in imagination, which is what the core object of the book is. And energy, labor, imagination. And it also got, I think, it was very effective in getting, as the hustle in the neoliberal sense often is, to disavow or deny or overlook the class aspects of this, right? To be like, oh, the majority of Black, not even the majority, I mean, far and away the majority, nearly, vast majority of Black people are poor, live in poverty. I'm sure that's only increased now in our current, 2025. And this was, true 10 or 15 years ago when I'm talking about too, of course. And it got Black artists in particular to go, oh, well, that's not important because what Black art is this kind of, almost kind of ideological or really more like imaginative space where I can transcend class, which is totally not, naive and dangerous, actually, I would say. And I no longer need to understand either myself, which again, this is not my case, but a lot of Black artists were from affluent backgrounds, or at least middle class, upper middle class. I no longer need to understand myself as fated to or connected with or accountable to the rest of Black people. And that's not what Black art is. And I actually would argue it's almost, maybe never been that. It is actually this hustle for sort of self-realization, and also the gratification I could get from it as a Black artist is the kind of gratification one gets from either seeing the Obama, Beyonce, person, or being them, which of course is a lot of money, power, and other things, the token. And so a lot of the hustle culture that I saw very intensely taking root in the Bay Area, especially, and again, I say it surprised me to meet Black people like this, which I realize it shouldn't have, because I think I had always thought of, there's that Fred Moten quote where it's like being Black is always being Black in groups, and I do think that's kind of true. I do think that is, the way one realizes, and one could extrapolate that to other, like being a subject is always being a subject with others, but I noticed that art was not that, and it was not the models of collectivity that I had vaguely become familiar with. When you asked about music, I was very influenced in college by, which, maybe they have a more complicated political history, so I'm not going to say whatever, but the Black Audio Film Collective was this Black British video and art collective. They're hugely influential. People like John Akumfa, and I don't think Isaac Julian was actually in it, but it was that period. And yeah, that was very influential to me. So I was like, oh, it would be so cool to have something like that or do something like that. They didn't seem to have a lot of money. Obviously, in Europe, there's a lot of public money for art that doesn't exist here much and exists here even less now. But meeting people that was never something they wanted to do or even think about. It was much more about individual success, making it, the hustle. And to other part you brought up is that often involved direct collaboration with tech companies, which are basically real estate, shell corporations in a lot of cases, right? Because of the way venture capital works. Like tech companies, real estate companies, and corporations, any other kind of thing that again, in the Bay Area at the time, as well documented on San Francisco, these tech companies were actively destroying Black people and Black communities, whether here on Market, whether East Palo Alto, whether East Palo Alto, whether Oakland was starting to kind of be a hub. That was when I think Uber was saying they were going to move their headquarters into downtown Oakland in the Sears building. That didn't happen, but it was very much talked about then, in like the mid 2010s.
And the murals came right along.
And the murals came along. There was Black Lives Matter murals in Twitter and all these other corporations, and I knew people who did these. And it was all kind of done under the dismissal or dismissive nature of the hustle. Well, hey, I got to make it. And I think this is very telling. How else am I supposed to make my art? And artists, Black artists in particular, maybe I think rarely think, well, maybe you shouldn't make your art. Maybe your art doesn't matter that much. Maybe it's not more important than Black people. There's the book begins with an Archie Shepp quote, which I could read really quickly because it's on the first page, and it says something. I don't see how things can get better for Black musicians until they get better for Black people. And I think that was the thing that really frustrated me, is a lot of Black artists would never make that connection, because I think if you go, and this is what the book argues, the history of Black art is about that elevated, special Black person who gets to look at themselves as different from Black people through something called Black art. And it was really kind of crazy making, because what you talked about this earlier with our living conditions, because it was like, their argument or their reason for doing a mural for Twitter would often be, well, how am I supposed to pay my rent? It's so expensive to live here. Yes, it is. Those companies are why. Like, when are you going to stop, do it? And it was kind of always that sort of argument where it was like, okay, you understand these basic things, but you're not willing to ever make them in a broader connection. And if you think it's expensive to be a college-educated, often, secretly from money, Black artist making art in the Bay, who, maybe still has friends that are more privileged too, because that's also part of that sort of security network. What do you think it's like for poor Black people here who, work service jobs and stuff? So it kind of is that myopic, very selfish, possessive individual's outlook that is very rooted in this neoliberal idea of the hustle, and that I would actually say sort of drove me out of my mind. I mean, I really had like a very much a psychic break with art when I was younger, and it was largely about a lot of the stuff in the book. So in some ways, the book is very much a coping or a way to understand why I felt that way and how I've come out the other end. A self-help book, nothing more American than a self-help book. Going back to Walden.
Thank you. Yeah. If you're making good art, there is overwhelmingly there's a chance that you will not make money off of it.
Yeah, I think it's just the idea that a comrade of ours will say this a lot too, which I think is very good, which is you will never get paid to do the things that are the most important to you. And another way I think that the same person has put it is you will never get paid to overthrow the world of capitalism. Like I do think there's something about that. And I think there's an absolute reckoning that something called art has to have with that. And I think you saw it in the 60s, and you can think of it a lot of ways. I'm very interested in film. I love film. That's actually probably my favorite art form. And you saw people making films collectively, and you saw people do theater. There's lots of examples, music, poetry, of people doing things collectively and not for money, and neither with money nor for money. And that was part of, I think in a weird way that maybe gets overlooked, that was part of the threatening moment in the 60s too, was you had people, yet especially younger people, who were like, I don't have to burn myself out. Or to pick the obvious example between, like, say, the World War II silent generation and the Vietnam generations of boomers, I don't have to die in a war to get the life I want. Whatever form of labor, we want to talk about military labor or, corporate labor. I don't have to do this. I could have a life theoretically where, the things that are the most important to me are actually the things that are not in the market, that I do not get paid for, that are not validated by the dominant system. And I think in the Bay in particular, when I moved here when I was younger, I expected there to be more of that.
I mean, I think of the 90s.
There is
and
some.
anti-sellout
in the
culture,
90s. Yes.
Riot Girl, etc.
Punk. Yeah, which unfortunately, you think of the Riot Girl, and it's like now you think of what's her name doing Hillary Clinton ads or whatever.
That's true.
But
Kathleen Hanna.
It's to your, that happens, and I think I always expected people to be aware of that and have more of a stance of refusal, because now we have no excuse. We've seen the for lack of a better word, it's one word I use, but it's not the main word. For lack of a better word, the appropriation or the co-optation thing that we're kind of alluding to. We've seen that enough. You don't have an excuse to not clock that and not give into it. So I think that was also what frustrated me at the time, is that there was not a articulated response against that, and it felt like a lot of people were very. A lot of the attitude, I think you asked a question about this, about the sort of fuck you, pay me. A lot of the attitude was actually antagonistic of anti-sellout culture, I think, which has to be, there's someone that's not going to be me. I think it'd be fascinating for someone to do a history of that period, which is so recent, but that period of, get your money, I forget what the expression is, but like, the only thing is your paper type of whatever was the saying, right? Like, get your bag. Right. All these kinds of sayings that were very popular and emerged in a certain kind of way from Black culture. That moment was so anti-sellout. It was so pro-sellout. Yeah. Right? That was really the goal. And I think that was pretty shocking to me, I think, as someone who didn't really meet Black people like that in my, previous experience as a child and a teenager. And I think grew up enough in the 90s, 2000s, that I was very much like you're saying. Like I was very into underground hip hop. I was very into underground music of any, of different sorts. And that was always the attitude, was like, fuck these corporations. Don't let them take our music, da 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 da. And that seemed to, again, when I said, Beyonce, Obama era got people, among other, lots of Black artists. I could think of more obscure, again, like the Khalil Josephs or the Terrence Nance, these are the film video people that kind of, there's lots of examples you can think of, like, that kind of got famous in our world, was a way to, and a lot of fine artists too, we could talk about, was a way to get Black people to reinvest, was a way, part of that was ideological and to make them to go, oh, don't criticize selling out. It's actually good. Make it cool and like part of the culture with like, fuck you, pay me. Like, this is the most important part. And make it, me, which was also an argument I encountered. Me doing this mural in Twitter is reparations. No. Just no. I think the younger generation seems more savvy to that, which is very nice.
That's the pod.
That's it. We're time.
I feel like.
Oh my God.
Like we got it. Yes. So
we chit chatted. Oh, okay.
Book is available now
at Duke University Press and all fine retailers.
Exactly.
I can't say the price. I don't know.
Plug?
We're making a film together, but we'll talk about that then. Yeah, which would be really interesting. And I had a question. Someone asked a very good question. It might have been you. When I did a book talk at a conference, was like, what about film is hopeful for you? And I had to think about that. I don't have an answer. So maybe if we confront that, like, why make a film if you have so many criticisms of what is called art? And I don't have an answer to that yet, but we'll talk about that then, I think. So stay tuned. Stay tuned. The book is called The Aesthetic Character of Blackness by Jemma DeCristo. That's me.
Available now
at QVC 1-800. This is Toshio Meronek. Do we close out with is it going to go dun 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 dun?
A short addendum. Jemma is in the practice of making a call for donations for people in Palestine when she's doing these public-facing events. So there will be a link to the Noon Mutual Aid, which is a chuffed.org donation link in the show notes. Thank you for listening to the show, and especially thank you to everyone who is contributing over at patreon.com/SadFrancisco. You're making it possible for Sad Francisco to exist. And if you're not already a member, think about joining. Again, it's patreon.com/SadFrancisco.